Your brain physically restructured itself to keep you alive in the house you grew up in, not as a metaphor, structurally. The white matter pathways connecting your emotional centers to your language centers, the circuits responsible for threat detection, self-regulation, and reading another person's face, they reorganized around the specific environment they found themselves in. Not because something went wrong, because the developing brain is designed to adapt to whatever world it wakes up inside. Take a slow breath. We have time, which means the person you became, the one who reads every room before sitting down in it, who adjusts mid-sentence because something shifted in the air, who feels a raised eyebrow the way other people feel a shove, is not the result of damage. That person is the result of intelligence. An architecture built precisely for an environment that required it. The tragedy isn't the architecture. The tragedy is that you had to need it. This is about the invisible line that runs from a specific kind of childhood home to the specific kind of adult that home tends to produce. A home built around a parent whose emotional needs outweighed everything else in the room. Where love arrived unpredictably, criticism was the weather, and your interior life, your anger, your sadness, your simply being tired on a Tuesday, didn't fit anywhere. In the second half of this, there is a specific finding from a neuroscience lab at Harvard that will reframe everything that comes before it, including, very possibly, the thing you have blamed yourself for longest. And there is something else I want to hold until we reach it. Something about the golden child. The one whose childhood looked fine. Looked better than fine. Even loving. That almost no one talks about. Before we reach the research, let me tell you what it feels like from inside. Because this kind of childhood doesn't usually look like abuse from the outside. It often looks like a devoted parent, sometimes an involved one, even an effusive one. The damage doesn't come from a single event you can point to. It comes from something far harder to name. The feeling, repeated hundreds of times throughout childhood, that your interior life was irrelevant unless it was useful to someone else's. That is where the science begins. Narcissistic personality disorder, as defined in the DSM-5, is characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a chronic need for admiration, and a fundamental lack of empathy for others. It affects roughly 1 to 6% of the general population, with higher rates when subclinical narcissistic traits are included. When this pattern lives in a parent, psychologist Nina W. Brown and researcher Carol McBride, whose 2008 synthesis on narcissistic family systems remains clinically foundational, describe a household where the parents' moods function as climate. When they are pleased, warmth arrives. When they are not, withdrawal or rage fills the space. The child's achievements are experienced by the parent as reflections of themselves. The child's failures are experienced as humiliations. Praise, when it comes, is conditional and comparative. Criticism is relentless, casual, or precisely targeted at whatever the child is most sensitive about. Boundaries don't function. Privacy is routinely invaded, not from malice, but because the parent genuinely cannot conceive of the child as a separate person with a separate interior life. This is the part researchers return to again and again. The narcissistic parent is not, typically, deliberately cruel. The damage does not primarily come from cruelty. It comes from consistent, chronic emotional unavailability, wrapped in occasional intensity. And here's the word researchers use for what this creates in the child. Not the word most people expect. Not trauma. At least, not the kind most people picture. Relational trauma. Psychologist and Sindis. Attachment researcher Alan Shore, across multiple decades of published work, describes relational trauma as the kind that accumulates invisibly inside the repeated micro-experiences of a child trying to connect with a caregiver who cannot fully receive them. It has no single moment. It has 1,000 small moments that together build something in the nervous system that is just as durable and just as shaping as a single catastrophic event. This matters because relational trauma doesn't look like trauma to anyone outside the home. It doesn't look like trauma to the child who has no other reference point. And often, it doesn't look like trauma to the adult that child becomes, until they begin, sometimes decades later, looking for the shape of it. That shape has several names. We're going to follow each of them. There is something you need to understand before we go further, because it changes the meaning of everything that follows. The infant nervous system is not passive. It is not a blank slate waiting to be written on. It is actively, continuously, and intelligently solving a problem. And the problem it is solving, from the first days of life, is this. What kind of world is this? And how do I need to be in order to survive it? Mary Ainsworth's landmark strange situation studies, beginning in 1969, measured for the first time how an infant's nervous system calibrates itself around the reliability of a caregiver. In a secure attachment, the caregiver is responsive, not perfectly, but predictably enough. The infant learns that distress leads to comfort. That comfort arrives. That the world can be trusted at a foundational level. In anxious and avoidant attachment, patterns that emerge when the caregiver is inconsistent, distracted, or emotionally unavailable, the infant develops different strategies. The anxiously attached infant amplifies distress, crying louder, clinging harder, because unpredictability makes intensity feel necessary. The avoidant infant suppresses distress entirely, goes quiet, becomes self-contained, because expression seems to produce withdrawal. Both strategies are intelligent. Both are precise adaptations to the specific environment the child actually inhabits. And if this is your story, you may recognize something in what Mary Main and Judith Solomon described in 1986 as disorganized attachment. A pattern that emerges when the caregiver is simultaneously the source of distress and the only available source of comfort. When the very person you need to run toward is also the person you need to run from. The attachment system and the fear system activate at the same time. The child approaches and retreats in the same moment. The internal wiring becomes genuinely contradictory. I need you. You frighten me. I need you. That wiring doesn't disappear when the child grows up. It gets carried into every relationship the adult forms, with partners, with employers, with friends, with themselves. You arrive in a new room and immediately begin a scan operating below the level of deliberate thought. What does this person need? Are they pleased? What does their face mean? How do I need to adjust to be safe here? The scan is so fast, it doesn't feel like a decision. It doesn't even feel like behavior. It feels like perception, as though you're simply seeing things other people miss, rather than running a threat detection program you built at 7. And here is something that lands hard even after everything else. Research on adults with histories of early relational trauma consistently shows elevated cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, in response to interpersonal conflict, even in entirely safe environments, even in conflicts that are mild, normal, and resolved quickly. The body hasn't received the update. A raised eyebrow becomes a warning. Silence becomes withdrawal. A slight shift in tone becomes something that requires immediate management. Your nervous system is not being irrational. It is being faithful, exactly consistent with the environment it was built inside. But that was only the beginning of what researchers found when they looked closer. In the early 1990s, psychotherapist Pete Walker was working with clients who had grown up in traumatic family systems, and he kept observing something that didn't fit the existing framework. He had been trained in the 3 classic threat responses: fight, flight, freeze. But his clients were doing something else, something that didn't have a name. They were appeasing. When threatened, emotionally, interpersonally, professionally, they didn't fight back. didn't flee, didn't go rigid. They moved toward the person threatening them. They agreed. They softened. They made themselves useful. They made themselves smaller, and the other person's comfort larger. And then they felt confused and ashamed about it, because from the outside, and from the inside, it looked indistinguishable from weakness. Walker named it the fawn response. He described it extensively in his 2013 work on complex PTSD, and it has since become one of the most widely recognized concepts in trauma-informed practice. The fawn response develops most reliably in children who grow up with a parent they cannot safely fight or flee from. A narcissistic parent cannot be confronted. Not really. Not without a cost disproportionate to the act. The child who tries to set a boundary, assert a need, or express anger discovers quickly that what follows is either withdrawal or rage, or the particular cold silence that is its own kind of violence. Flight is equally unavailable. A child cannot leave. So the only strategy that works, the one that keeps the peace, keeps warmth available, keeps the child safe, is management. Become useful. Become agreeable. Read the mood before it erupts and redirect it. Make the parent feel seen, admired, important. Make your own needs disappear into the background noise of theirs. And do this so consistently that it stops feeling like a strategy and starts feeling like who you are. Here is what needs its own space. Before Pete Walker named this a survival response, it had a different name: codependency. And codependency was not treated as an intelligent adaptation to an impossible situation. The concept, which emerged primarily from addiction treatment literature in the 1970s and 1980s, located the source of the problem inside the person who had learned to fawn, not inside the environment that had made fawning necessary. It treated excessive attunement to others' emotional states as something the person had somehow developed by choice or weakness, rather than something they had been trained into by necessity. An entire generation of people who had been emotionally conscripted in childhood to serve a parent's psychological needs were told, as adults, that their responsiveness was a dysfunction they had chosen. Teachers had called them mature for their age. Extended family had called them such a good kid. Therapists called them codependent. Nobody said, "You learned this at the feet of someone who needed you to." That is where productive anger is not only appropriate, it is the accurate response. The fawn response was not a failure of self. It was learned. And because it was learned, it is not permanent. That distinction matters more than it is possible to convey in a single sentence. But hold it, because we will need it later. Stephen Porges developed polyvagal theory beginning in 1994, and it offers one of the most useful frameworks for understanding what relational trauma does below the level of thought, in the body itself. Porges identified that the autonomic nervous system operates across a hierarchy of states. The ventral vagal state, the social engagement system, is where we feel safe, connected, open, capable of learning. The sympathetic state is mobilization, fight or flight. The dorsal vagal state is shutdown, collapse, the freeze that comes when fight and flight both feel impossible. In a healthy early environment, a child spends most of their time in the ventral vagal state. When threat arrives, the sympathetic system activates. And then, when the caregiver provides reassurance, the child downregulates back into safety. The nervous system learns the full cycle: activation, return, rest. If this is your experience, you may already feel where this is heading. You never reliably got the return. The moment of distress was followed not by predictable reassurance, but by unpredictability. Sometimes warmth arrived, sometimes more coldness, sometimes rage, sometimes the particular thing that is hardest to describe. A parent who seemed fine on the surface, but whose presence felt dangerous in ways you could not articulate. Over time, the nervous system stopped expecting to fully return to rest, because rest had costs. because the next shift could arrive at any moment, and being unprepared was something you could not afford. So the baseline shifted, not to full sympathetic activation, that would be unsustainable, to something subtler, a low continuous scan of the environment, a quality of attention that never completely softens, shoulders that never fully drop, a default state that looks, from the outside, like anxiety. That looks, from the inside, like simply being awake. The clinical literature calls it hypervigilance. The word doesn't quite capture the texture of it. The way it isn't dramatic, but is instead almost ordinary. A background hum that runs beneath everything. A tiredness that a full night's sleep doesn't touch. You are not on edge exactly. You are on watch. There is a difference. On edge implies panic. On watch implies something quieter and more durable. A nervous system that has decided, based on the evidence available, that complete rest is a risk it cannot take. And there is something this produces in relationships specifically, something the clinical literature tends to describe in technical terms that don't quite capture the texture of living inside it, that belongs in an honest account of what this costs. Research by Judith Herman and others in the field of complex trauma has described how chronically hypervigilant individuals can sometimes be more comfortable in low-grade conflict than in genuine peace. Conflict is familiar. Conflict has a shape you know how to navigate. Genuine, sustained safety. A relationship with no volatility, no need for management, no emotional weather to read, can feel, paradoxically, more threatening than the familiar difficult thing, because the nervous system was never trained for it. Researchers call this hypervigilance. The body calls it home. And there is a structural finding about what this does to the brain itself, one that changes what it means entirely, that we are almost ready for. Families organized around a narcissistic parent often sort their children, consciously or not, into roles. The literature on narcissistic family systems, built on Murray Bowen's foundational family systems work from the 1950s onward, and extended by later researchers, describes two positions in particular. The scapegoat receives the parent's displaced anxiety and criticism. Their presence is associated with conflict. They are blamed when things go wrong. They grow into adults who carry the knowledge, at a cellular level, that they are too much, too loud, too sensitive, too difficult. Their wound is visible. They tend to seek help sooner, because the pain is harder to rationalize away. The golden child is harder to talk about. From outside the family, their childhood looks fine. Better than fine, sometimes. The golden child received the parents' approval, was held up, admired, used as proof of the parents' worth. But the price of that approval was the complete suppression of their own authentic interior life. The golden child cannot fail, cannot need, cannot feel the wrong things at the wrong time. Every success reflects on the parent. Every struggle is a threat to the parent's self-image. The golden child learns to perform, tirelessly and perfectly, a version of themselves that the parent can use. They grow into adults who achieve, sometimes extraordinarily, but who feel like frauds inside every achievement. Because the self doing the achieving never quite felt real. Because that self was built for an audience, not for a life. And here's the finding that almost never makes it into the conversation. The golden child often carries as much psychological damage as the scapegoat, just quietly, and in a different direction. Gregory Yurkovich's 1997 research on emotional parentification, the process by which a child is assigned an emotional caretaking role they are developmentally unequipped to hold, found elevated rates of depression, anxiety, identity diffusion, and difficulty forming autonomous adult identities in children who had been made into emotional caretakers. Regardless of whether their childhood had looked, from the outside, warm or even loving, the golden child, in adulthood, often doesn't recognize themselves in descriptions of narcissistic families. They think, but my parent loved me. My childhood wasn't like that. And then they wonder, privately, why they feel so hollow. Why no relationship quite fits. Why being alone is sometimes less exhausting than being loved. If you are that person, if the word that keeps stopping you is, "but they loved me," that experience belongs in this conversation too. In 2006, Martin Teicher and colleagues at McLean Hospital, affiliated with Harvard Medical School, published findings from a research program examining the neurological effects of childhood maltreatment. They used diffusion tensor imaging to measure white matter integrity in the brain, the structural pathways that connect different regions and allow them to communicate. What they found was this: verbal abuse from a parent produced measurable, structural changes to white matter tracts. Changes to the arcuate fasciculus, the pathway connecting language processing centers. Changes to the corpus callosum, connecting the two hemispheres. Changes to the circuits involved in emotional regulation and integration. The magnitude of this disruption was comparable to what was found in children who had experienced physical abuse. Not a fraction of it, comparable to it. Take a breath. Let that sit for a moment. Because here is what that finding actually means. And this is the part that reframes everything that came before it. Those structural changes were not damage in the sense we usually mean the word. They were adaptation. The developing brain is more plastic in early childhood than it will ever be again. It is designed, across millions of years of evolutionary pressure, to calibrate itself to the world it inhabits. A brain that develops inside a safe, predictable, warm environment calibrates itself for safety and connection. A brain that develops inside a volatile, unpredictable, emotionally dangerous environment calibrates itself for threat detection, behavioral flexibility, and the management of people whose moods could not be anticipated. The hypervigilant brain, the fawning brain. The brain that reads every room before entering it, that tracks micro-expressions the way other people track conversation, that never fully rests because resting, once, had costs. That brain was built correctly. It solved the problem it was given, which means the anxiety, the scanning, the fawn response, the patterns in who you choose and why they feel familiar. These are not signs of a person who broke under pressure. They are signs of a person whose developing nervous system did exactly what it was designed to do. It built a survival architecture precisely suited to the environment it found itself in. The tragedy is not that the architecture was built wrong. The tragedy is that you had to need it. And the further tragedy, the one that accounts for so much of what is difficult in adult life, is that the architecture doesn't automatically dismantle when the environment changes. You left. You grew up, moved away, built a life, became an adult with choices your 7-year-old self never had. But the nervous system came with you. The scanning came with you. The sense that love is conditional, that needs are an imposition, that the safest version of yourself is the one that makes itself useful and small. All of that was packed, invisibly and completely, into the body that walked out of the house. This is why the adult child keeps choosing partners who feel like the dynamic they grew up inside. Not because they are broken, not because they lack awareness, because the nervous system recognizes that emotional weather. Uncertainty reads as intensity. Inconsistency feels like depth. A partner who withdraws warmth triggers the same activated state as the parent did. And activation, in a nervous system calibrated for danger, can be misread as aliveness, even as love. The alarm is working. It just cannot tell the difference between then and now. Let's be honest here, without flinching and without adding comfort to what hasn't resolved yet. For you, if this is your story, adulthood arrives with a particular set of invisible costs. Some look like relationship patterns. Some look like personality traits. Most don't look like what they actually are, which is a very intelligent person operating in the present with a nervous system calibrated for a different world entirely. The cost of hypervigilance is the inability to rest inside safety. Genuinely safe environments can feel more threatening than familiar difficult ones, because the nervous system doesn't trust the quiet, a kind. Partners' consistency can feel flat, or boring, or like something is wrong, or like the other shoe is about to drop. You may have spent months, or years, waiting for someone gentle to reveal themselves as unkind, and that waiting kept you from actually receiving what was being offered. The cost of fawning is the progressive erosion of a self, when your primary relationship strategy is becoming what another person needs, when you have been doing that since childhood, when your safety once depended on it. The question of what you actually want becomes genuinely difficult to answer. Not because the answers don't exist, because you learned so early and so thoroughly to override them that accessing them requires excavation. You can become expert at knowing what other people feel. Your own interior landscape can become, paradoxically, the territory you know least well. There is a specific cost that rarely gets named in the literature on narcissistic families, and it belongs here. The cost of having been the parent's emotional regulator. When a child is used as a confidant, a best friend, a mirror for the parent's greatness, a buffer against the parent's anxiety. When a child's job is to manage how the parent feels, they spend the years that should have been used building a self, instead building a system for managing someone else. Lindsay Gibson's 2015 work on emotionally immature parents describes this process in granular terms. The child who is turned to for emotional support, for validation, for the particular quality of attention that should flow from parent to child rather than the other way around, learns to orient entirely outward. The child's antenna is always pointed away from themselves. In adulthood, this produces something that is very easy to mistake for a generous personality. The adult who is parentified can walk into any room and intuit, almost instantly, what each person needs and how the dynamic is shifting. They are often the ones who notice when someone is struggling before that person has said a word. They are skilled listeners, skilled caretakers, skilled at making others feel understood, and they are often quietly exhausted in ways they cannot explain, because the skill runs constantly, even when they are not at work, even when they are alone, even when there is genuinely nothing to monitor and no one to take care of. The exhaustion is not weakness. It is the cost of running a system designed for an emergency in conditions that are no longer an emergency. And here is what Mary Main's adult attachment interview research, conducted over decades beginning in 1985, found. The way a parent narrates their own childhood, not what happened in it, but how coherently and openly they can speak about it, predicts their infant's attachment style with approximately 75% accuracy, before the child has developed any pattern of their own, which means you carry, in the way you tell your own story, the seeds of what you might transmit, unless something interrupts it. That is not a verdict, it is a direction, and direction can be changed. Before we reach what the research says about how, there is one more layer that belongs in an honest account of this. One that is genuinely difficult to hold, but important. The parent who built this environment was, in most cases, also a child who wasn't received. Psychoanalytic researcher Otto Kernberg, whose work on personality organization spans 5 decades, has described narcissistic character structure as developing partly from early experiences in which the child's authentic self was not adequately met. Experiences that produced a grandiose compensatory self built over a fragile, shame-saturated interior. The narcissistic parent who needed their child's adoration, who experienced their child's independence as a threat, who could not tolerate their child's separate emotional reality. They were, in many cases, a child who once needed something they did not receive either. This does not excuse what happened, not even slightly. The harm was real, the shaping was real, and the parent, as an adult, remained responsible for the choices they made, regardless of what drove them. But understanding it does something specific. It lifts the question of whether you were somehow uniquely unworthy of being fully seen. You were not. The limitation was not about you. It was about the room that parent could access. And it was a small room, smaller than you deserved to be held in. The invisibility was not a verdict on your value. It was a measure of their capacity. Here is the finding that sounds, at first, like a cruelty. The same neurological plasticity that allowed a developing brain to reorganize itself around a difficult early environment remains, partially, narrowly, with sustained effort, available in adulthood. The window is smaller. Change requires deliberate work rather than just consistent experience. But the brain is not fixed. Daniel Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology research and Bruce Perry's neurosequential model, articulated throughout the 2000s and 2010s, both document the capacity of the adult brain to form new neural pathways through new experience consistently encountered. Perry emphasizes that healing follows the same sequence as development. It begins in the body and moves upward toward language and reflection, not the other way around. This is why insight alone rarely changes the fawn response. Knowing you're doing it and being able to stop doing it are different processes, operating in different parts of the brain. The parts most responsible for regulating the fear response, the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, are also the parts most depleted by chronic early stress. You cannot think your way out of a threat response using the circuitry the threat response has suppressed. Not because you aren't trying hard enough, because the architecture doesn't work that way. What does work, what the research actually supports, includes approaches that begin in the body rather than the mind. Somatic experiencing, developed by Peter Levine, and sensory-motor psychotherapy, developed by Pat Ogden, work directly with the body's held patterns and incomplete defensive responses, the ones that became frozen in place because the environment never became safe enough to let them finish. These approaches don't ask the body to reason its way out. They ask it, gradually and in safety, to complete what it started. EMDR. Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. Developed by Francine Shapiro in 1987 and now studied extensively, has shown consistent effectiveness with PTSD in meta-analyses published through the 2000s and into the 2020s. Researchers and clinicians are increasingly applying its framework to the relational, developmental variety of trauma we have been tracing here, with results the evidence base is beginning to support. And here is what matters most, and what comes directly back to Mary Main. The most consistent predictor of breaking the intergenerational transmission of attachment difficulty is what Main and colleagues called earned secure attachment. Not born secure, earned secure. The pattern of adults who began life in difficult attachment circumstances and through consistent experience, most often in a safe therapeutic relationship, but also in reliable friendships and sometimes in stable partnerships, developed the capacity to narrate their own childhood coherently, not painlessly, not with the complexity resolved, but coherently, with access to their own experience, rather than either idealizing it or dismissing it entirely. Adults who reach earned secure attachment pass on secure attachment to their children at rates comparable to those who were securely attached from the beginning, based on the available research. The transmission genuinely can be interrupted. The architecture can be renovated, not demolished, but changed in ways that matter across generations. Not because the childhood was different, because the story about it finally became yours to tell. And this is what it gives, eventually, though no one should be told it arrives on a schedule or without cost. The person who spent years reading rooms becomes, through this work, capable of a depth of genuine empathy that people who never had to develop it don't always reach. The person who suppressed their own needs becomes capable, slowly, of a quality of self-knowledge that requires excavation to find. And that is more durable for having been earned. The person who learned to track other people's emotional weather can learn, in time, to track their own. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, a remarkable thing. The fawn response doesn't disappear, but it can become a choice rather than a reflex. The scan doesn't stop, but there can come a moment, and then many moments, when you catch yourself doing it, pause, and recognize that this particular room does not require it. That pause is everything. Not because it fixes the past, because it interrupts the repetition of it. You are checking his face again, mid-sentence. Your eyes move. The scan begins. The one so fast it feels like breathing. You feel the familiar pull. Adjust, soften, find a different ending. Make sure the air is still safe. And then something small happens. You notice. You hold it for a moment. The noticing itself, the awareness of the thing running, the way you might hold a stone that has been in your pocket so long you forgot the shape of your own hand. You finish your sentence where it was going. You don't stop scanning. Not entirely. Not yet. That is not how this works, and you know that now. But you stay in it. You let the words land where you meant them, and the world holds. You built this at 7 years old. Carefully, with everything you had, to survive in a place where it was necessary. It worked. It kept you safe. And it kept working long after the environment that required it was gone. Because that is exactly what a well-built architecture does. It is not who you are. It is what you learned. Those are different things. They take time to feel different. More than insight. More than knowing. More than being told. But the distance between this is my personality and this is what I was trained to do is the whole corridor through which change can eventually walk. The home you grew up in was not the world. It felt like the world. It was your entire world. But it was one room in a much larger building. And you have been carrying its floor plan as though it were a map of everywhere. It isn't. You are allowed to need things, to be difficult and tired and present and uncertain, to occupy space without earning it first, to stay in your sentence without checking someone's face. The nervous system takes longer than the mind. The body takes longer than the nervous system. Change follows sequence, not schedule. That is not weakness. That is how the architecture gets renovated. What you actually are, underneath the scanning, underneath the fawning, underneath the years of making yourself small enough to be safe, has been there this whole time, waiting for you to come home to it. If this found you at a quiet moment and something in it settled somewhere useful, a like or a gentle subscription means this kind of work keeps reaching the people who need it. There's no rush. We're not going anywhere. Your brain built you to survive. The rest is yours to write. Rest well.